Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
My friend Katherine Stewart is a journalist and author. She does a lot of writing, especially about state church issues. She is author of The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children. That book released 9 years ago. More recently, The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. This could not be more topical. Katherine Stewart, thanks for coming. How you doing?
It's great to see you again and to connect with you.
You have written a new article for, was it in the New Republic? Was that where the primary publication was?
That's right. The piece is about the Catholic side of the Christian nationalist movement. People often refer to the Christian nationalist movement as an evangelical movement, but it doesn't just include conservative evangelicals. It includes a number of hyper-conservative Catholics, as well as members of other faiths, of course, but right-wing Catholics play an outsized role, I would say, in shaping the ideology of the movement, in funding, and behind-the-scenes political activity. A lot of their activism is focused on the courts.
The article takes an angle that's different than I've heard, which is why we're talking. How Big Money is Dividing American Catholicism. The subtitle is A Schism in the Faith Between Liberals and Conservatives is Being Exacerbated by a Group of Plutocrats. Okay. So now we're talking about people who are powerful essentially because they have deep pockets, they have resources, they are rich, and they are power players within the Catholic Church. I've always seen the Catholic Church as big business. I don't want to put you on the spot. Would you agree, Katherine?
Well, you know, there's a real schism within the Catholic Church. I think a lot of people in the pews emphasize the social gospel teachings. Many of them are involved in soup kitchens or helping the homeless or things like that. But the hard right of the Catholic Church is very clearly pro-free market, pro-capitalist, essentially libertarian. And, you know, on the other side, you know, Catholics have this social gospel tradition, but that's not what you're finding in the Catholic right. And they meld that hard right libertarian economics with the culture wars to get the rank and file on board when it comes to voting. So Catholics are actually very diverse in our country. You know, last election, they're about 50-50 split, although I think a slight majority voted for Joe Biden. But there's this other side that is very much using the so-called culture wars to drive support for the far-right politicians that are not just aiming for, you know, a union of church and state, trying to pulverize the wall of separation, what's supposed to be a wall of separation, but also trying to ally with politicians who are bringing on board policies that are intensifying economic inequality and distorting the meaning of religious freedom.
You hear that sound, Katherine? That's the sound of pro-capitalists and libertarians angrily mashing at their keyboards. And so, I mean, beyond the philosophical question of what type of economy, free market or otherwise, is best, how do we best serve the poor, eliminate waste and corruption, etc., your angle is not necessarily a commentary on someone's philosophy about the marketplace, but the using of capitalism and deregulation to consolidate power. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. The religious left and right are often compared and contrasted in their sort of theological and cultural orientation. But the religious left is underfunded, right? It's comparatively undercentralized. And it has a tendency toward volunteerism and declarations and sometimes marches. But the religious right is really interested in the political here and now. It's very much working toward domination of the nerve centers of influence. And it owes its strength and its disproportionate influence in our politics to decades of investment in all of these tools of modern campaign infrastructure like data, media, messaging, on all of these things that drive voter mobilization.
I want to come back to this tug of war within the Catholic Church, the focus of your article. Let's talk about the Pope for a second. You know, Pope Francis, for me, since he replaced Benedict back in 2013, I can't read his mind. But beyond the stuff I have a real problem with, and the religious window dressing and all that, I mean, he's essentially the CEO of God Incorporated, okay? But I can't help but wonder if he wrestles with perhaps his own desire to be more inclusive against what I think is probably the greater force of the Catholic machine, thousands of years of influence of the church, his own dogma, his own Bible, and maybe when nobody's looking, he's off in the corner and he's just having a real tug of war about all this stuff. But I mean, I don't know. Do you have a position on the Pope?
Whatever my position is not as relevant as the fact that he has a lot of enemies within the church. He's frequently castigated by reactionaries and hyper-conservatives as a fake Catholic. In January 2021, the Archbishop of Los Angeles, who is currently the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, they published a statement saying that Biden was going to advance moral evils with his support for birth control and other reproductive rights and his approval of marriage equality and these other kinds of issues. And the fact is no other president, Trump wasn't singled out in a similar kind of document. So I published this piece in the New Republic contrasting the approach toward the faith of these two men, one of whom is, I would say, representative of the Catholic left named Robert Bush, another one who's a big funder of the Catholic right named Timothy. And since I published the piece, I've heard from a number of individual as well as groups of Catholics around the country who are really upset about efforts to drag what they see as a faith centered on social gospel to the right. These are folks who are really concerned about care for the poor and the undefended, and they sort of draw on a long history of Catholic teachings on those issues, and they're really upset about it. A group of them had actually written a letter to their archbishop saying, why did this letter go out where we're being warned that Biden is going to advance moral evils with his support for birth control? I mean, you didn't do this for Trump. So they're just kind of trying to point to the hypocrisy. But it does speak to a larger sort of tug of war within the church.
I see a tug of war within Francis himself, and it's hard for me. I can already hear the angry keyboards coming my direction. How in the world would you ever say anything complimentary or, at least not condemning of Pope Francis? I mean, he's an opponent of reproductive choice. He supports an anti-woman establishment, essentially. But it really does kind of look like he's trying to crack open some doors. He's looking for more women's rights, female deacons, LGBT recognition. He's been a proponent of interfaith cooperation. There's this famous letter from, 6 years ago where he said something about atheists, people of good conscience, might actually still qualify for heaven, which is blasphemous in many Catholic circles. So, I have this conversation in my brain. I'm wondering, is he merely the enabler of Vatican shenanigans, or maybe he's just a guy who's trying to bend the system in progressive directions from within? This conversation doesn't really fit in a cookie cutter, does it, Katherine?
It doesn't exactly fit into a cookie cutter. And it's interesting if you look at his stated concerns about the environment. Those stated concerns received a tremendous pushback. We know that the religious right, the Christian Nationalist movement, is incredibly hostile to the cause of environmentalism, right? They call it a false theology. Many of the leaders of the religious Christian nationalism point to initiatives like the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, which is issued these declarations that environmentalism is a false theology. They actually compared it to, they called it a liturgy of the Green Dragon.
The Green Dragon. The Green New Deal with sustainable energy. Dragon. Forgive me, Catherine. I walked all over you. Go ahead.
It's quite all right. But it's interesting because you see the sort of pushback to his statements of concern for the environment. I mean, there's a lot of contradictions because he also eschews statements of concern for the poor. But I don't think without the ability to sort of determine our fertility, our families, American families, or any families can really have any kind of economic self-determination. So the opposition to birth control, which remains a teaching, is very problematic.
I find it interesting that so many are terrified of Biden. I look at that guy and I don't think he's a poser. I see a devout Catholic, right? I see somebody who's probably a true believer. Many people, though, in the higher tiers of that church consider him the great Satan or an agent of the enemy. And I can't jive those in my brain. Have you navigated that?
I just think for the hard right, he doesn't conform to their politics, to their economic vision. And, with his nice words about people who are non-heteronormative, don't conform to their ideas about the so-called correct sexual order. He's very threatening with his nice words about the poor and with his nice words about the environment. They just think that this is a kind of a heresy. So they're very unhappy. I've seen a lot of materials, and I don't have them in front of me, so I can't cite them precisely, but where people have said, he's not really properly Catholic, he's a fake Catholic.
The no true Scotsman fallacy, right? Within a Catholic church that's worth an estimated $30 billion, we see this struggle. The more progressive Catholics who genuinely may want to go out and be a positive influence on the culture, and others who say, God is a capitalist, or perhaps they've even weaponized the finances of the church to establish what you have termed in the article pro-Trump theology. Do you see a shade of kind of a savior figure narrative? A lot of fundamentalists gravitate toward an authoritarianism.
Absolutely. Christian nationalism is anti-democratic. It's anti-equality. It doesn't, frankly, believe in the rule of law. It doesn't believe in representative government. It's allied with a much more authoritarian form of political power. I mean, when you look at leaders around the country who have supported Trump, who is so patently amoral and didn't respect the rules, they're trying to overturn a legitimately decided election. You can see that that's not a democracy. They have no respect for representative democracy or a system of governance or a notion of equality. It's really about authoritarian rule. And that's how they could so easily compare Trump to figures like King Cyrus or King David, an imperfect ruler through whom God chose to enact his will. Well, here's the thing about kings. They're not kings of democracies. They don't have to respect the rule of law. They are the law unto themselves. So it sort of gets to the fact that this is a movement that is not compatible with modern pluralistic democracy.
So this particular shade of the Catholic Church then becomes a type of kingmaker, especially with the resources at play. The Catholic Church, over 1 billion professing Catholics on planet Earth, 1 billion of them. The Vatican Bank has about 8 billion in assets. It's a tourist mecca for 13 million people, visitors every year. They own 1,800 plus properties in the private world. They're hugely diversified: schools, nursing homes, hospitals, businesses, sporting venues, telecommunications, towers. And all of this, or at least a great deal of this, is sort of shielded under the religion label, much of it tax exempt. So, I mean, for money and power, it's hard to beat the Catholic Church, right? I mean, they're definitely a franchise player. Some would argue an empire. And yet within this empire, there is a war of ideas and ideals. Can you tell me more about these two men with the last name Bush, Robert and Timothy, that you sort of anchor the article with?
Robert Bush is a middle-class guy who works in development at Stanford University. He is very upset about efforts to drag his faith off to the right. He is committed to social justice. He's very influenced by Vatican II. Timothy Bush is an heir and also a very wealthy business owner who has poured his resources into many of the leading hyper-conservative organizations that are trying to take their faith to the right, including Napa Institute, an organization that he founded that hosts $2,600 annual conferences for leading figures such as wealthy donors, think tank folks, Republican politicians, and right-wing clergy. He sits on the board of EWTN, which is known as the Fox News of Catholic media. Oh. They supposedly reach 250 million viewers. Legatus, which is an organization for hyper-wealthy business leaders in that world.
And I was looking at his, forgive the interruption, but I was looking at his biography, Timothy Bush. He's an attorney, he's an investor, estate planner, CEO. He's got his fingers in how many pies? Hotel development, resort development, grocery chains. He represents the tax concerns of organizations, including religious ones. And, of course, these fat cat glad-handing events like the $2,600 a plate deal. He sounds a little bit like the Koch brothers.
It's true, although I would say the Kochs were more libertarian than Christian nationalist. David Koch was famously pro-choice.
But weren't the Koch brothers like part of the machine of hardline conservatism in the United States, propping up kind of the Fox News culture?
The alignment between Christian nationalism and libertarian economics is so close that they're not going to let theological quibbles get in the way. Kochs contributed to a lot of religious right adjacent initiatives, including those used by the religious right. I'm thinking about some of the data initiatives that they funded, such as I-360. So,
if we're talking over coffee, Katherine, then do you think that sort of hands-off libertarian idea enables the power players to better operate unchecked?
Well, absolutely. But here's the other thing. If you didn't have abortion and same-sex marriage or LGBT issues and the culture wars to dangle like shiny baubles in front of people, how on earth are you going to get them to vote for the hyper-conservative political candidates that are going to promote tax policies that are intensifying economic inequality? We've really entered a second Gilded Age. This is a movement. The religious right claims to stand for family values, but the politicians that they're allied with have promoted economic policies that are making it so much harder for American families to succeed. Timothy Bush has said things like capitalism and Catholicism can work great hand in hand. And he sort of talked about how President Trump was ushering in a time of light and the Obama presidency represented a time of darkness. So they're really all about sort of the unity of these two issues. And you see these two things, the sort of economic libertarianism and the religious right. You see this in the writings of people like Ralph Drollinger, David Barton, a lot of the leaders on the evangelical side as well.
Talking here with journalist and author Katherine Stewart. Did you see, just a quick aside, did you see the video of CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee conference, where they rolled that gold statue of Donald Trump down the hall?
I know. The golden calf. What can I say?
Have they read the Old Testament? But there's a lot of that. You talked about, what they call a season or era of light?
Ushering in a time of light.
A time of lights. So we have the culture war, which you've referred to, within the Catholic Church. And yet one side is much more well-funded. This is not an equitable battle. This isn't a 50-50 tug of war.
No, absolutely not. The religious right has a few things on their side. Number one, they've got a lot more money, access to public and private money. They're focused on very much on the politics of the here and now and in tools that are going to turn out the vote. And there's a certain internal discipline that they have in a way. It's almost like a tight ball, whereas if you look at sort of the moderate left spectrum, it's almost like a bunch of feathers. It's hard to kind of get them all corralled in the same direction. So I think that right now the Democratic coalition for sure is stronger than it's been in a while because of the sort of everyone wants to put the last 4 years behind us, but it remains fragile and, always susceptible to infighting. Although, frankly, on the Republican side, there has been quite a bit of infighting too. I thought it was really interesting that Trump is now saying you need to donate to my campaign rather than all of the organizations that have traditionally sustained the GOP. And we know that a lot of the support from the GOP has always come from those religious right advocacy groups and Ralph Reed's Faith and Freedom Coalition, which promised to donate, I can't remember how many tens of millions of dollars to the 2020 election, all of the money that funnels through these groups, all the messaging materials that reach people in their churches and reach the rank and file through their social media, through specially targeted data initiatives.
Do you think everyday Catholics are even remotely aware of the tug of war, sort of that culture war going on with the power players on the higher tiers of the church?
I don't know, but I hear from the ones that are aware of it. And I've heard from large numbers of Catholics since that piece came out in the New Republic who are engaged in similar efforts to that of Robert Bush, trying to resist efforts to drag their faith to the right and trying to reaffirm the social gospel teachings that they have long taken to heart.
More with Katherine Stewart. I want to talk about the bigger picture in the United States. We're seeing the mad scramble we've been seeing. The mad scramble of Christian nationalists trying to turn the whole country into their specific church, and they're doing crazy, alarming, dangerous, and often illegal or at least unconstitutional stuff to try to lock everybody else out of the party. We're going to talk more about these sneaky maneuverings of the Christian nationalists with my guest, Katherine Stewart. Hang on. My patrons get the broadcast 2 days early, and they get it totally commercial-free. Thank you so much for your support. It really does help. It really means a lot to me. And if you'd like to become a patron, it's patreon.com/Seth Andrews. My special guest is Katherine Stewart. She's written a couple of amazing books, The Good News Club and The Power Worshippers. Most specifically, we're talking about her recent article in the New Republic, How Big Money is Dividing American Catholicism. Just talking like real people, Katherine. We're just hanging out. If the best incarnation of Jesus Christ was walking around today, what do you think he'd say about the Catholic Church? I mean, what do you think?
The Catholic Church is so diverse, just like every other faith. I mean, Judaism is diverse. Evangelicalism is diverse. Christianity is extraordinarily diverse.
You're right. It's an unfair overgeneralization. I think probably what I mean to say is if Jesus had run into the power players like Timothy Bush, what do you think Jesus might say?
Well, I don't know what Jesus might say.
Oh, come on.
But I'll tell you what Robert Bush said.
Okay. All right.
Brought up the story it's a parable of the Good Samaritan who stopped on the road to rescue a stranger who had been attacked by thieves. And, he was talking about this story and how it's really important. We've got a country where the top 1% of our country have now amassed more than $34 trillion of wealth. And the bottom 50% of our country only has $2 trillion to split amongst the bottom 50%. And he said, this is a Bible story that we need to remember.
I'm interested in myself. Decades ago, I used to be a Fox News Christian, and I bought into that sort of blame the poor for being poor narrative that's very common in the right wing. I think it's a way of brushing off responsibility, societal responsibility, but it used to be, this is America. And anybody who applies themselves, pulls themselves up by their bootstraps, regardless of class or, financial struggle, skin color, whatever, you can be whatever you want to be, 'cause America. And if you don't, well, you probably just didn't apply yourself. I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed of that attitude that I used to have. And yet it remains rampant among these right-wing evangelicals within and outside of the Catholic Church. Yes?
Some of whom are themselves struggling. I mean, we have an economic system now. Look, I'm not a socialist, but the widening, the disparity between sort of haves and have-nots in our country has really gotten very extreme. We've reached a level of inequality we haven't seen since the days of the robber barons. And many American families are working. You've got 2 parents and 3 jobs, and they still can't make their ends meet. And meanwhile, things like, longer commute times and all these things are associated with family breakdown. I mean, there are just a lot of families that just can't make it work anymore. And also, think about the price of housing. I don't know about you, but when my parents bought their house, my dad was, working. My mom had taken some years off to raise the kids. They could afford a house. They got a 25-year mortgage and very nice house. And it, I don't know, maybe cost them $40,000.
Wow.
And the way that the housing costs have risen, it's put homeownership beyond so many American families. So there are just so many different factors that are making it much more difficult today, even than we saw 30 years ago.
So now, post-Trump in the United States, we are seeing some alarming maneuverings by the right-wing evangelicals, the power players, who have lost the popular vote. In some ways, they are starting to see that they're losing the culture war, but the fringes, or at least those particular groups, are becoming radicalized.
I watch this and I write about it. I think that they lost the elections, but they're still advancing their agenda through state legislatures and through the courts. The movement has always been so focused on the courts. And even during the Obama years, I started writing about the Christian right back in 2009. And I published a book of warning in 2012 about the religious right broadly. And people were like, what are you talking about? Obama's the president. This is like a fringe movement. It's just going to go away. But what they were doing all those years, even during the Obama years, is advancing their agenda through the courts by very carefully picking the right cases, bringing them to the right courts to set into place these novel legal building blocks that were eventually going to decimate the separation of church and state. And frankly, that's happened. We have a grossly unrepresentative Supreme Court now, 6-3. About 23 to 24% of the federal judiciary is comprised of Trump appointees, most of whom are sort of Federalist Society, groomed and promoted in the sort of right-wing legal terrarium, which is in many ways sustained by many right-wing Catholics, including Leonard Leo and all the folks sort of allied with him.
Well, we're also seeing it at the state level, the governorship, right? The governor of Arkansas, he just signs into law a draconian abortion ban, limiting the reproductive choices of women. And that edict or that law is religiously motivated. We've seen the same thing happening in Alabama, Tennessee, et cetera. So you've got that going on.
That's true. And they've actually, in Arkansas, he specifically said that he was setting this up to be challenged in the Supreme Court. They were trying to bring a case to the Supreme Court because they know with a 6-3 majority, they're likely to get the win that they've been after for a really, really long time.
Because most of the Supreme Court justices represent an Abrahamic religion. I can't speak to the religiosity of all, but I think more than half are practicing Catholics. And I'd like, well, if roughly a quarter of Americans identify as non-religious, meaning they're secular, they're not necessarily atheists, that number's smaller. But I think to myself, where's the representation in the courts?
Right. And well, there are a lot of pro-choice Catholics, too. In fact, there's an organization called Catholics for Choice that a lot of Catholics, of course, take nuanced views of the issue, just like a lot of other folks do. But the conservative majority on the Supreme Court is sort of hard right. And by the way, they're trying to carve out even more privileges for religious organizations than religious organizations already have. Let's just look at how they're dealing with the COVID public health restrictions that are supposed to apply to both religious and non-religious organizations. In Santa Clara County and also New York City, the Supreme Court, these districts had put into place restrictions, public health restrictions on gatherings that would apply to book readings in bookstores and viewings of films and also worship services in churches. So everybody's on the same equal level. And the Supreme Court swooped in and said, oh, this is unconstitutional insofar as it applies to religious organizations. That's a violation of their religious freedom. I mean, look, there's no evidence that officials in either Santa Clara County or New York City were taking advantage of the pandemic to inhibit the free exercise of religion. I mean, when a fire code requires that, for instance, all buildings have smoke detectors, it's not infringing on the religious freedom of churches if they say that churches have to have them too.
I've never understood, the idea that in order to have prayer, you have to have it in Close proximity to worship God cannot be an individual exercise to pray, read the Bible. Even teaching can't be done. I mean, other people are adapting in the year or years of COVID. And churches seem to be like, well, if we can't gather in person, this is somehow persecution.
Well, I think that they love that persecution narrative because it's how the religious right cultivates their base.
What is that line by Emerson? Let me never make the vulgar mistake of declaring I am persecuted when I am merely being contradicted. That's a paraphrase, but I've always liked it. So now, we're seeing the weaponization of the filibuster. We're seeing voter suppression. I mean, there's some crafty shit going on here in the United States in preparation for 2022 and 2024, much of it fueled by the evangelical Christian nationalists.
That's true. Voter suppression is really important. I think there's nothing more patriotic that one can do than to defend the right to vote. But they know that they can't win elections by the numbers. I think Trump himself is caught on audio saying if everybody were able to vote, Republicans would never win another election.
I was having a conversation with somebody before November, and it was right after the election. And he actually said the words to me. He said, well, if you don't count the mail-in ballots, Trump won. And we looked at him, and Natalie and I both looked at him and said, by mail-in ballots, you mean ballots? Right. I mean, but now we're looking at, the elimination of mail drop boxes and, sort of other restrictions. All this stuff is really coming into play. Do you have any thoughts about the days, months, and years ahead? I'm not asking you to be Nostradamus, but as you look ahead, I mean, do you see the pluses and the negatives, and what are your thoughts?
I think, folks who reject the politics of conquest and division that the Christian nationalist movement is trying to promote have become savvier. I think there was a lot of denial for a long time, and I think that denial is sort of over. And I think people are trying to be a little more clever about how they meet these challenges. So, for instance, I saw the other day a challenge to some of the voter restrictions in the state. They're running this sort of challenge in the state of Iowa and claiming that some of the restrictions are a violation of the rights of Iowans. And it's great that it's run in Iowa because I think there's a lot of coded and not so coded racism that's baked into the Christian nationalist movement. Even members who might sort of say, oh, we're not racist at all, they're still driving support for a political party that engages in race-based voter suppression and gerrymandering. I mean, what is this cancellation of Sunday voting, but a completely hypocritical, racist application of voter restrictions? I mean, there's been all this sort of voter engagement, voter activism in conservative, right-wing, largely white churches. So, but all of a sudden, when folks in majority black churches start trying to engage their congregations in voter turnout, the right gets upset. So I think it's, anyway, very smart that they're sort of trying to mount this challenge in Iowa, which is just a pretty homogeneously, not entirely, but largely white state.
In some ways, it's like watching the power players like a cornered animal. I mean, in some ways, as they are faced with a looming statistical minority, they become more dangerous.
That's right. They can't. The reason they're disproportionately represented in politics is because they get people to vote in disproportionate numbers. So, like, if you look at George Barna, who he is. He's that right-wing evangelical pollster. But he does some pretty good research. He said in 2020, only 9% of voters were the most, he called them SAGE cons. It's an acronym that means spiritually active, governance engaged conservatives. He said there were only 9% of the population, but 97% voted in 2020, and 99% of those voted for Trump. And it shows you that if you can get a small number of people voting in vastly disproportionate numbers, you can really swing an election.
Activating people, I think, often through fear. I mean, there's a culture of people that is very responsive, I think, to fear messages. They're coming to take away your rights, your freedoms, your liberties, your job, your children. I mean, that's the Fox News culture, right? That's
true. And I think that's what all of this sort of, they're banning houses of worship, trying to allow public health officials to limit all gatherings, including gatherings in houses of worship. I mean, it's a gift for them because they're like, we can use that as a way to claim that we're being persecuted, even if it's patently untrue. I mean, again, if public health officials say you need to have fire alarms in every building and churches alone say that's a violation of our religious freedom, well, it's not. It's just having to do what everybody else does for matters of public health. And it's temporary, of course. We're just, no one's trying to cancel church or cancel religion. But, that persecution narrative is really what they use to solidify their base. If you can get everybody feeling like they're put upon and believing these ridiculous fictions like, Christians are the most discriminated people in America, which is patently untrue and absolutely ridiculous. But
they're coming to they want to cancel, they want to make Christmas illegal. And you and I are looking around going, what?
Where do you live? Like, in what neighborhood? It's like kind of amazing. I know, but it's really funny.
Well, as we wrap up here, Katherine, I'm not a billionaire. I'm not a fat cat. I'm not holding $2,600 a plate dinners. What can you, what can people like the members of our audience here, what can we do to help solve this dilemma?
A lot. There are things we can do as individuals, and there are things we can only do when we join together. As individuals, of course, get out to vote, but also do what they do. Like, I remember watching an Evangelicals for Trump event, and Johnny Moore said, become an evangelist for the vote. Well, they do that. I mean, that's one thing their movement is really good at. They make people convinced that no matter how old you are, no matter how young you are, no matter how disabled or whatever your condition is, your vote matters, you matter, and you can bring people in your circle, make sure they're registered. They don't make you feel ashamed if you haven't registered or can't figure that out. They really walk you through the steps. And, votes matter, not just national elections, but also in midterms, and local elections matter. So it's really important to be politically informed about what's happening in your area, because a lot of the stuff runs through state legislatures, and then a lot of the community stuff runs through your, school boards and things like that. But there are things we can really only do when we join together, like investing in policy groups or joining policy groups and contributing your time and your efforts to advocate for your values.
I like the idea of banding together to try to solve problems and achieve things. There are some people who are like, well, I'm not a joiner, but I just think that's kind of a naive way of looking at it. We're more effective. If we're one soldier throwing pebbles at the castle walls, what do we really accomplish? But if we are an army of people, we can really, start to break through and achieve some things together. Katherine Stewart, she has the article, How Big Money is Dividing American Catholicism. I will link to that new Republic in the description box of this broadcast. You are always a great guest, Katherine.
Oh, you are always a great host.
I would also encourage everybody to read The Power Worshippers. And I think what's interesting about that book is, you're not as hard as I am on religion, but you are great at exposing how religions are weaponized by the powerful. And The Power Worshippers really gets into how Christian nationalism has been, in many ways, made more effective by people who may or may not even necessarily buy it, believe it, but they sure know the power of weaponizing God for their own ends. Would that be a fair assessment of your book, Katherine?
Absolutely. I hope it's clear that I'm not hostile to religion itself. My issue isn't with religion. It's about the weaponization of religion for political purposes and the exploitation of religion for political purposes.
Katherine Stewart, always a pleasure. Take care. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming free thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.